What's up, Beardos? You're listening to episode 114 of The Bearded Vegans.
Basically, our whole philosophy boils down to don't be a jerk.
Let me answer your question first. Not answering your question. I really hope people didn't tune in to hear us talk about beards. Beards. About beards.
What does that mean, Paul? The fake beans, the fake brown, red pole.
Who knows, Andy? I don't know.
Welcome to the show. I'm Paul.
And I'm Andy.
And we are The Bearded Vegans, a podcast featuring a dissection of all things vegan.
If you're just tuning in for the first time, you can find all of our previous episodes at thebeardedvegans.com. And you can always reach us by emailing thebeardedvegans@gmail.com.
In today's episode, we continue our winter break retro film review series with an in-depth review of If a Tree Falls, a story of the Earth Liberation Front.
Yeah, this is a nice juxtaposition to Bold Native last week, which covers similar territory.
I agree.
Yeah, so good choice, Paul. This was your choice for the review series.
Yes, but it was your choice to put these in this order, so good on you, Andy.
Damn, I'm good.
So in case you missed last week's episode, this is in lieu of taking a break for the holidays. Andy and I, we do need our rest. But in lieu of that, we've recorded some film reviews that are movies that didn't come out while we were making this podcast. So we thought we'd go back in time and watch some of these older movies. So if this is your first time listening to The Bearded Vegans, this is not going to be the typical episode, but we hope you do still enjoy this one nonetheless.
Yeah, so Earth Liberation Front, not quite the Animal Liberation Front that was covered in Bold Native.
One letter away.
Yes, so close, so close. So as usual, we'll be doing a little bit of a general thought section, then we'll be doing a spoilerful section. This is a documentary. I don't know if there's really... I guess there's a bit of a storyline here. You're not sure entirely how things are going to end up, but I feel like you get a pretty solid sense of where things are going pretty early on.
Yeah, but I think it's, I'll say this right now, it's a film worth watching, I would say.
Absolutely. I think this film to me was very enthralling, and very captivating.
And it's all on YouTube, so you can watch it for free if you want.
Yeah, go watch it for free. If you haven't seen it yet, I think it's always more enjoyable to listen to a review of a film you've actually seen. So go give it a watch. If you just Google If a Tree Falls film on YouTube, you'll find it. So yeah, give it a listen. Anyway, so this film, the plot synopsis from IMDb is a rare behind-the-curtain look at the Earth Liberation Front, the radical environmental group that the FBI calls America's #1 domestic terrorist threat. And this film is directed by Marshall Curry and Sam Coleman. And I was just looking at their respective IMDb's, and they have both gone on to do some other documentaries. Sam Coleman especially has been the editor on a bunch of other, including the most recent Amanda Knox documentary. So yeah, they've been off and doing things. And it's kind of interesting because with Bold Native, which we just reviewed, it was to me clear, and then also very clear from the interviews I read afterwards, that the filmmakers were people that had like a vested interest in this particular message they're trying to get out.
Yeah.
And then this film starts off, this whole film follows the story of Daniel McGowan. It does talk about sort of the formation of the Earth Liberation Front, but its framing device is this story of Daniel McGowan, who's someone that was involved and had some legal issues that get into in the film. And the film starts off with Daniel McGowan works at the same domestic abuse organization that the filmmaker's wife works at.
Oh, is that what that was?
That's what that was. So this was kind of a story that kind of fell into this filmmaker's lap. It's not someone that was like deeply entrenched within this movement and then decided to examine it. And I think that actually makes for a much more interesting film. But Paul, this is one you wanted to bring back up. When did you last see this film? What did you remember about it? And like, what were your general overall thoughts on this film?
I think I watched this, I'm just going to guess, it was not more than 8 years and not less than 3 or 4 years, I'd say. So somewhere between, when did this movie come out?
Well, it certainly wasn't more than 8 years because it came out in 2010/2011. So.
Okay, I would guess that I probably saw it in 2012 then. And I remember being super interested in it, and it was not, and this was, at this point I had been vegan for, I would guess 3 or 4 or 5 years. And so I was invested in that, but I did not know much about the purely environmental movement. So it was kind of a it pulled back the curtain, as they say in the IMDb, and kind of, you know, let me into that world a little bit. And I appreciated that because there are certainly parallels. And yeah. So I was interested in it then, and given a rewatch, which we just did, I am still interested in it and would recommend this to watch with other people. I think I don't think this is spoiling anything, but it poses the question of what is the definition of terrorism, and are these people that committed these acts that did not hurt us, that were carried out intentionally to not hurt anyone or to not injure anybody, should they be considered terrorism? And I think that how they portray a lot of the characters, given how they portray a lot of the characters, I think that this could be a useful watch for people that don't have the most positive feelings about these sorts of actions, because I think it does go into their motivations. It goes into why they did these things. And I think it's an honest film. The people that participated in these things talk about how they feel about them now that it's been some time later. They question them. So I think it's an honest, well done film. I don't think it has a lot of bias. I think they do a good job showing both sides, and in an unbiased fashion. So I appreciated that. I think it was a well made documentary.
Yeah, I think I would definitely have to echo those sentiments. I thought that I don't know if I could say it's 100% unbiased, because there is like a large portion of the film when you're like along for the ride with the ELF and they're playing like Rage Against the Machine. And
Yeah.
There's property destruction happening, and I feel like in some level the actions that these people are doing are romanticized a little bit in the film, or at least portrayed in a way that you're like, hell yeah, they're sticking it to the man.
Yeah.
But then they do come back and interview people, and both people that commit these actions show some remorse or questioning the strategic nature of what they did. And they also interviewed some of the people that are affected by these actions, which I thought was a pretty bold move, bold native move. And I actually appreciated that. And I guess we could talk a little bit more about that in spoilers. But overall, I really loved this film.
Yeah.
Like straight up, this is probably one of my favorite films that we've ever reviewed on the show, I think. I think that it's very nuanced. It's exciting to watch. It's emotional. It's sad.
Oh yeah.
Hold back tears at
Yep.
times.
Yep.
Like
Same.
just, these are things, I think it brings up stuff that I ponder when I think about, especially when I first got into the movement and I was like, what's going to be most effective? And is it time for me to give up my chance at freedom and go, do more direct actions? And but what about prison? And all of these things, I think a lot of people, when they enter the movement and they're trying to figure out what's the best thing to do, they might be juggling some of those things in their mind. And thankfully I went the podcast route so that I can see Paul in person all the time, but it's one of those things where these are things I've thought about. These are things that I think anyone in any sort of social justice movement has to wrestle with in their own head. What route do you want to take? Who do you want to support? Who do you want to maybe sort of quietly agree with but not show your public support for? What actions are actually going to work? And this film does such a great nuanced job of exploring those things. I could have watched this film if it was 3 hours long. So much. I could watch this if it was a 10-part series. I love the way this was put together. It's not by nature of, it's a lot of archival footage of police beating up protesters and forest destruction. And it's not like there's tons of beautiful aerial drone shots. And, it's not beautiful in that way, but the subject matter is just so powerful and so compelling. And the interviews they get are so interesting that, to me, I didn't even think about that stuff for a second, other than, what am I going to say about this for the podcast? So,
yeah,
a very well put together film, very concise. I love that it laid out this great roadmap. I feel like I complain about this often with a lot of documentaries, that I'm like, God, I didn't have a really nice, clear roadmap for getting from point A to point B in the narrative. I felt like this really did.
Yeah.
I think it did a fantastic job. I never felt lost. I never felt like they were asking me to make mental leaps that the film didn't thoroughly explain itself while moving along in the path. And so just a really solid film.
And I, on that roadmap point that you made. I do like how, they choose to focus in and go into detail about specific incidents, and then other incidents they'll say like, oh, and this incident happened. So you're not kind of bogged down with going into details about every single thing that happened, but you go into the details to get a better picture about just like all the ideas in general and what was happening in these other cases as well. So I thought it was really, really well done.
Cool. I feel like we move straight into spoilers and just have a more detailed discussion now. But I think for anyone that's not convinced by what we just said, again, it's free. What do you have to lose aside from an hour and 25 minutes of your life? And definitely when we get into the spoilers, I do want to kind of talk about like, what can this do for the vegan movement? You already said there's definitely related things going on. Obviously, the types of actions that are taking place in this film certainly relate to the types of actions being taken place in Bold Native that we just watched. But yeah, with that said, go see the film. Definitely recommend. I don't think that you'll regret it. I think it's very insightful and definitely gives you a view into a world that a lot of people, myself included, were not really privy to.
Yeah.
So with that said, let's get into the spoiler section.
Let's do it.
For If a Tree Falls, starting right now.
Hey, come on. I haven't seen it yet. It doesn't have anything to do with the plot. Still, I like to go in fresh.
So Andy,
Yes, Paul?
one thing that I wanted to talk about, and you thought that some of the film had a bias to it, and I agree. It's like it's a film that definitely wants you to feel sympathetic for the main characters, I guess you would say, the main players in this movie. But it throughout the entire movie, I believe it was the assistant district attorney was in it.
The older guy? Yeah.
He was in it.
Great. I thought he was great in this film.
So I'm going to get to him in a second, and then there was an undercover cop who was also a large part of the investigation. What did you think
the
of him?
most smug look on his fucking face.
Shit-eating grin.
God. Oh.
The whole time.
Killed me.
Yeah. And then you had already, I think you had mentioned, it also interviewed a couple of the people who are affected by some of the arsons, whose business.
Like the lumber farmers.
Yeah. And I appreciate so much that they put those in. That one guy with that grin, it got to me a few times, but
he was so pleased with himself.
Yeah.
He was just like, oh, FBI.
Granted, I will say, if I was in his shoes and I had been working on something for like 15 years,
He's stoked about that guy.
Yeah, but the older guy, who I think was like the assistant district attorney, I thought that his inclusion in the movie was great, not only because he provided the information about what was going on from their perspective through basically the entirety of the movie, how the government was reacting to these sorts of things, how the FBI was reacting to these sorts of things, but then also he has one of not the final, but he has one of the final moments in the entire movie when he says something along the lines of, when we first started investigating these people, you're just like, these people are jerks. They're lighting things on fire. We got to catch these people. But then since the case went on for so long and they're following these people and they kind of see how they grow and they start to understand some of their motives, even if they don't agree with how they went about it, they understand and are, it seems sympathetic towards what they want. And I think that the inclusion of that was so important because I think that that's the person that, for someone who's not on board with these sorts of things, that's the person who they're going to relate to the most. That and the grinning guy. But that's
who's going to relate to that grinning guy aside from other cops?
But that's that you know what I mean though. That's who they're going to relate to. And when they see that guy being able to have that perspective on things, I think that that's super important for people that come into this movie with a negative view about these sorts of actions.
Yeah. It's interesting because I'm thinking about, there was recently a segment on a show called, I think it's called The Doctors, as like Dr. Oz and a couple other people, and Dr.
Dre,
Dr. Seuss,
Doctor Who.
It was about What the Health. And one of the Dr. Garth Davis was on there like arguing with them and stuff, but one of the guys that was sort of anti What the Health was like, I thought it was an interesting documentary, but I can't believe you didn't include like differing viewpoints. In my head I was like, but their documentary, they have a specific point of view, and the differing viewpoints are the standard viewpoints that are all around. Like, why would you even need to include that? But then I watched this documentary of like, oh, they were able to include those differing viewpoints. And granted, I guess the health is not, this is maybe more subjective. It's like ethics and tactics and stuff.
Yeah.
Whereas like health is like, in theory, there's facts that you can look at, and
In theory.
right, that you can look at and debate. So maybe it's a little different there. But this film is like a really good example of how you can include different viewpoints and have it strengthen your overall film.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, obviously, you need to pick and choose who you're interviewing with this. Like, those interviews could have gone very different, and maybe there were people that were interviewed that were also part of the FBI who they decided like this isn't really going along with what we want. So that's very, very possible, and it wouldn't surprise me. So, yeah, obviously you have to pick and choose it, but I 100% think that it bolstered the main message of the movie.
Yeah, in the very short time between us finishing the film and then you setting up to record, I did read a little bit of an interview with one of the directors, and he was basically saying, it was hard to get access to all of these people, and I had to be honest with them and tell them, this film is not about your point of view necessarily, but I promise that I won't like distort your words. I won't cut out after before you say but and then explain something.
Yeah.
Like, you will be accurately represented. And then later in the interview, he was saying, I think it's really interesting to find people with strong opinions and then just sort of put them up against each other and let the viewer decide how they feel about it.
Yeah.
Now, granted, we're following Daniel McGowan, who is, I would say, a pretty likable on-screen presence.
More likable than Charlie.
Charlie. Yeah, and you're following him, and then he is interacting with, he's saying goodbye to his family, and they're crying, and he's going to go to prison for maybe up to 8 years. And so you're certainly in the position, you're not following the assistant district attorney's journey and his you're definitely put in the shoes of one of the people that is the most affected by the situation. So I think the film does ask you to be more sympathetic, but again, maybe that's necessary because the point of view from the law enforcement side of thing, that's just like regular old Law and Order society. So why does that really need to be explained all that much? It just needs a bit of a presence in the film. And then really the most interesting thing is, why would someone do this thing? Why would they take what many people consider to be a really extreme action? And I feel like the film does a really good job of explaining that, more so than Bold Native. I mean, Charlie espouses all this stuff and like very clumsily explains all the things, but I feel like it was done much more succinctly in this film.
And it felt natural.
Yes, it definitely felt way more natural. But Bold Native set a pretty low bar on that in that regard. And
when they included some of the like lumber workers as well, I did, even though some of the stuff they were saying I didn't agree with, like when the guy is saying like, oh well, our business is lumber, so we're not going to cut down every tree because then we would be out of business. Like, so you could consider us environmentalists. It's like I didn't agree with that, but I appreciate that they put that in without commentary. They let you kind of pick up that this is kind of a silly fact.
Well, it's like, I don't know, because I feel like anyone that's not versed in these issues would be like, yeah, that actually makes sense. Like, of course, they need to make sure that they're going to replenish their supply. But it reminds me of the farmers who say, it's not good for business to have sick pigs. So obviously we're going to treat our animals well, or else we wouldn't have a good business, you know? So, but yeah, it is interesting that they sort of they're like, here you go, without commentary, you decide how you feel about this whole thing. But I thought it was affecting when the guy was like, showing the lumber mill owner, who was the picture of him walking around the burnt out office, and him saying like, are they going to burn down my house, or am I going to start my car and it's going to burst into flames? And some people might say that's irresponsible to make you sympathize with someone that's doing what a lot of people consider to be a bad thing. Yeah. But it certainly makes for interesting filmmaking. I can say that.
Yeah. The scene where he's talking about, getting the call. He's describing getting the call at 2 a.m. and it's like you can definitely sympathize with something that this is your entire life, and even if someone doesn't agree with it, you can't take away the fact that this is the thing that they do every single day and this is their life and it's been taken away from them.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why I think this film does a good job of exploring many of the sides of this whole thing. It's very commendable, I think.
Yeah. Do you think that, moving on to a different topic, did you think that because it keeps focusing around these, I wish I remember the number, like 12 or so activists, and they keep showing their pictures, like their mugshot pictures.
Yeah.
But it only really goes into a handful of them. Do you think that the filmmakers didn't have access to the other ones just didn't want to do it? Maybe for legal reasons they didn't want to do it. I was actually surprised that the fact that this documentary was being made while the court case was going on,
Yes.
and they just kind of talked about it all. I mean, I would imagine at that point, their lawyers have already seen all the evidence that's presented by the other people. So they're like, well, we can talk about all this stuff because if I have here that says Daniel did this thing at this time, I could say that out loud and it's not doing anything. But I was surprised at how open they were.
Well, I have some insight into that from that interview that I read. Again, originally the filmmaking was taking place before everything was kind of settled in the court. I had forgotten that it sort of ends at him going away to prison. For some reason, I thought that there was more of like life after prison kind of stuff in it. But I guess that's because I have like friends who are friends with him and I've seen his presence on social media since he's been out and have followed his case. But the filmmakers originally said that it was really hard to get him to sign on because he's like, I got in trouble because I spoke to... I spoke to him. I shouldn't have said some stuff that I said to someone. And I mean, but like also if you have 11 other people that are on tape and they're going to like snitch on you, I don't think he should beat himself up as much as he was, because it's like he was going to go down. If all those other people, like 9 of them were going to be informants, like he was something bad was going to happen to him. But it's just a little bit worse by the fact that he was on tape. But anyway, because of that, he is really wary to like let a filmmaker into his home. But eventually he was saying that I think that there's something really important to be said here. I think it's important for people to question the use of the word terrorist in regards to what we were doing. So that's why he let him in. And during the filming process, I guess for like 90% of it, he was still claiming to be innocent because legally that's what he needed to do. And so it wasn't until the final hearing happened where he like agreed to the plea bargain and all these things that he was finally able to say he did it. So the filmmakers thought the mystery and the narrative arc of the story was going to be, did he do it or didn't he do it? And then they realized that's not the most interesting aspect of this story. The most interesting aspect is like how and why did he do this? So that's why the film starts off with him straight up saying, I did these things. So
that's interesting because that means that they might have been filming for a while and then all of a sudden the entire direction of the film gets changed. And it doesn't, I don't think it specifies in the movie, but there might not have been a tremendous amount of time between him deciding to take that legal route and then going to jail. So they would have had to get like a whole bunch, like, all right, I just want you to talk as much as you can about what happened, and then we can edit the things together later. But
yeah, they said they had to just do like a totally different editing tactic after they decided that's the angle they were going to take.
Well, they did a good job.
yeah. No, I certainly would not have realized that's what they were trying to do. And yeah, I agree with them. I don't think it would have been as interesting if you're following someone and you're not sure if they did the thing or not. I don't know. I mean, I guess that's what like the Jinx, that whole series with Robert Durst, that was kind of like, did he do it? Didn't he do it? So there is some aspect of the mystery there that can be compelling.
Serial?
But I think that they were smart to take that route of here's someone that has committed what often is deemed very radical action, and let's explore why this person, how do they become radicalized in this way? I don't know if I want to use those words because I feel like that's sort of playing into this notion that defending the earth is a radical thing when I feel like it should be a normalized thing. Regardless, sort of following his journey and his story from this guy that grew up in New York City to committing these arsons out in Oregon and Seattle and whatnot is a very interesting story.
Yeah, and I definitely think that if they were going the whole didn't he do it route, the movie would have had a completely different feel. And I don't think the message of like this is not terrorism would have been as strong.
Yeah.
Because it wouldn't have been the focus. He wouldn't have been able to talk and explain his motives, and
Yeah.
he wouldn't have been able to explain how he felt and those sorts of things. It definitely wouldn't have been as strong. So
Yeah.
I think that it's good that it worked out like that.
Yeah, definitely. But going back to your point about how it was probably hard for them to get a lot of these interviews, to me, the one that I was surprised was willing to talk on film was Suzanne Savoy, who was his ex-partner. She is someone that did take the deal and became an informant.
Yeah.
And, you know, in this movement, if you turn Stitch, like, that is a scarlet letter on you. That is not something that you come back from. And you're a pariah, I suppose. And so to be willing to sort of tell your side of the story on the film, I thought was really brave of her. Like, I couldn't imagine. That's a deep sense of shame, I'd imagine, for anyone to sort of turn on their friends in that way. Mm-hmm. But I also think the film does a really good job of exploring, like, you can't say what you would do unless this actually happened to you. And, like, I'm like, yeah, if my options were the rest of my life in prison, or maybe just 3 or 4 years, or no time at all, because the end credit thing said that she served 4 years, and Jake served none. Like, I think the film makes that understandable.
Definitely. And even with Jake, who is like the one that kind of set off the domino effect,
the one who turned into Guy Fieri.
Like, even with him, I mean, it's like I have to feel a little sympathy for him when they leverage his child against him.
Yeah.
You know, it sucks.
Yeah, it feels bad. But I think the film also shows a great example of that whole nobody talks, everybody walks thing. I'm not saying everything would have been great, but the fact that they bluffed that they had certain information that they didn't, and he then admitted to it. Like, man, everyone just needs to shut up. Whenever you're talking to a cop or the FBI or any law enforcement agency, say as little or nothing at all.
But again, I think if, like Suzanne was saying, if it's hard to tell how you would react unless you were in that position.
Yeah. Which I think is like one of the biggest dangers of doing these types of operations is like, the more people you bring in, the more things can come undone, the more puzzle pieces will fall out.
Should have told that to Charlie.
Charlie.
Was that the footage of Jake, was that footage from this documentary maker, or was that other footage? Because it looked
the interview?
Yeah.
I thought it was from this
really?
documentary.
Because I feel like it had a different quality.
I think it was just the Hawaiian shirt that was throwing you off.
He's living large now. I don't know. I felt like the interview the camera had a lower quality that made me think it was an older interview.
It's possible.
But for most of the stuff, they like cited
Yeah.
some of the sources when it wasn't obvious.
I would be really curious to see a documentary that sort of followed his progression, because I'm wondering, like, what are his views now? Like, he's wearing a branded, corporate logo hat. It just feels like that would be counter to the Jake that we're introduced to early in the film.
Yeah.
I'd be really curious to see a documentary that's kind of exploring people who were really radical and then potentially became way less radical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Make it, Andy.
Nah. So, Paul, you already mentioned like the potential parallels between this and like animal liberation activities or veganism. How can this film be used as a tool for education in that regard? Like, what are the parallels that you do see?
I think that, well, besides the parallels of, I'm sure, like besides the parallels of being vegan for environmental reasons, besides those parallels, just in terms of just activism, I mean, I think we see some of those same parallels in Bold Native, where there's the more extreme approaches, there's the extreme approaches, there's the less extreme approaches, and this movie goes into those, but for environmental reasons. But I absolutely think those could be extrapolated and applied directly, as almost directly as they are with the environmental reasons for animal reasons. Just instead of burning logging mills, you're burning like agricultural centers, which they did do one. I think there was one of them.
Yeah, the horse slaughter facility. And in the beginning of the film, they did show footage of whaling
Yeah.
as well. But otherwise, the animals were pretty devoid from the whole thing.
But you know what I mean? Like it at the beginning of the movie, it kind of goes into how a lot of people were doing protests, and then there was this group of people that felt like the protests weren't doing enough, so they kind of took more direct actions. Like, I feel like that absolutely applies to veganism. I think that the types of activism and how you do those actions, or how you do that activism between fighting for the environment and fighting for animals, is almost identical in a way that, like, trying to compare animal activism to a different social, like a human social justice issue. I feel like that's what sometimes people try to do those things.
Yeah.
But there aren't as many parallels between those. I think that there are a tremendous amount of parallels between, like, the environmental movement and the animal movement.
Yeah, certainly. And I think probably one of those biggest parallels is the fact that each one is working on behalf of a group. Like, everyone in that movement are allies to the animals, to the environment.
Yeah.
They're working on behalf of, which I think is kind of interesting, because that then lends to the conversation of what happens when people take these more radical measures and say it's in the name of something, but the something it's in the name of can't then speak back and say, I'm not sure that I liked how you went about that. That's not how I would advocate for myself, kind of thing.
Yeah.
I feel like this film did a really good job of helping me understand why someone would go down the path that they did go down. I think especially that footage of the people that were taking what some would still consider pretty radical action, chaining themselves to tractors or whatever it might be, or the trees, that whole story, where they cut up the guy's pant leg and they're spraying pepper spray. I didn't realize pepper spray would affect just like your skin, but that, and when they're like rubbing pepper spray in the eyes of people.
Intense.
Like, I don't think anyone could watch that and not feel like, fuck the police, like, fuck these people for treating peaceful protesters this way.
Yeah. No, I'm thinking about that scene where the people climbed up in the trees, and just in terms of editing and filmmaking, I love how when they were describing that shot of the person having his pant leg ripped, they had someone telling the story, but then also the guy himself telling the story, and they would cut back and forth. Yeah. It's almost like they're corroborating the story of what happened between someone retelling it and then the firsthand experience of the person. I just thought it was nice editing.
Yeah, and I can't believe that they like sprayed him down. I thought just to get the pepper spray off. But the guy was like, they just sat in a prison cell soaking wet and covered in pepper spray. And it was just like another punitive measure that they took. Yeah, it pissed me off. Like, I was just like, oh God, put on that rage right now.
Yeah, it's no, like you said, it's easy to understand why people would, when they consistently march and protest for these things, and after 10 years, I think it was, in one of the areas, they don't see any progress, and then they do one action, and it's like they, as they put it, it's like they did what 10 years of peaceful protests couldn't do in one day, in one night. So it's like I do get it.
Yeah, and that, even though I guess I'm someone that's inclined to be supportive of those types of actions, I do think that this is a film that you could play for someone that has not had any sort of inclination towards any side of this issue before, and it would have them understanding and maybe feeling a little bit on the side of the ELF members. I think especially because I don't think the film ever, correct me if I'm wrong, has anyone that is totally unrepentant about what they did or wasn't able to see some faults in what they did.
I think you're right.
And again, another reason why I think it's kind of brave for some of those people, especially Suzanne and I guess Daniel, was to admit that they burned down this tree farm that on totally false intel.
Yeah.
Like, that's like, fuck, like, thankfully no one died, but like, how do you deal with that, like, mentally for the rest of your life, that you just caused this immense amount of damage to someone that wasn't doing what you thought they were doing?
Yeah, it sucks. And I think it was both those actions, that tree farm, and then there was the library that they burned down, one, it like spread further than they thought it was going to, and two, the person that was doing the research, I think, like wasn't there anymore. Or no, that was the truth. But in the library, I think it did. They said the fire spread much further than they thought it was going to.
Yeah, they thought it was just going to target the guy's
The
office or
researcher's
something,
office,
and then spread. So yeah, I think it does a really good job of exploring the upsides and the downsides. Like, it does have this moment. It's like, oh, in one day we accomplished what we couldn't do in 10 years. But also, look at the coverage we're getting. They don't care about the why. They just care about the how. They just care about catching the people. And so, yeah, I think it is a film that really does let people make up their mind.
And do you think that this film could be a powerful tool in getting people to realize that these sorts of people aren't committing acts of terrorism?
I don't know, because I 100% agree that it's outrageous to call it terrorism, but I also think that someone could point to what they're doing and be like, yeah, that's terrorism. Just because they don't kill someone, they're sabotaging. I personally agree that you can't do violence against an inanimate object. But also, I'm wondering if that's just an issue of semantics that we get bogged down in. Like, whatever it is, the intent is to intimidate or to shut down. Like, if it doesn't shut down the facility, the hope is that it's such a terrifying thing that why would anyone want to continue in that industry? So you're attempting to coerce people into doing what you want. So I could see someone watching this film and still being like, yeah, it's terrorism. It's just like that one guy was saying at the end, you don't have to be Bonnie and Clyde to be a bank robber, and you don't have to be Al-Qaeda to be considered a terrorist. So I don't know if it's like guaranteed to get people to go, oh, it's kind of ridiculous. But I do think it sort of paints more of a picture of what's at stake. Although I think they could have done a better job at really relaying how horrible the environmental damage is. They did have lots of, environmental destruction footage, but it almost, I don't know, it would have thrown me out of the film if they started to go, here's a pie graph of all this land,
yeah, exactly.
And, some animations like Cowspiracy or something.
I actually didn't think about that fact until you just pointed out now. Like, Bold Native did more of that kind of factual exposition thrown at you where it's like, did you know that, like, this is what happens in, like, blah, 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 this is what happens with male chicks. That was more like factual than what this actual documentary did, but
An actual factual.
But like you said, I think it would have maybe messed with some of the flow of how the movie was presented. And I don't think that this movie is trying to recruit people for the ELF. I don't think it's trying to I don't even necessarily think it's trying to recruit people to become environmental activists. I think it's trying to give you a better understanding of people that already are environmental activists. So for that reason, I think maybe that's one of the reasons why they didn't choose to include these things, because that wasn't part of their agenda.
Yeah, I agree. And again, in that interview where the director is kind of saying we're trying to just present these strong points of view and butt them up against each other and let people decide, and basically kind of get everyone a little closer to the middle and to understand each other. And the director said, I don't think that we're going to get an ELF member to become a prosecutor, and I don't think we're going to get a prosecutor to become an ELF member, but I do hope that they will start to understand each other better. So I did think that was kind of interesting.
Yeah. And from what you said, what you told me about how the filmmaker didn't, as far as I gathered from what you said, didn't have any stakes in this beforehand. It was just his wife happened to work with Daniel.
Yeah, the story just fell in his lap.
Yeah, so it's like he didn't have that agenda to begin with anyways.
Yeah, definitely. So, yeah, as much as I love the film, I don't necessarily know if it's too much of a piece of activism, other than it could get people to question the use of the label terrorist. But I think it's not like you should do this. It's just like, here's a window into an interesting world. And there's a lot of documentaries like that are just like, you should see this interesting world that you're not privy to. And so it's almost more of like a piece of fascination than it is a piece of education. But I did feel educated on this world of activism that I was not, when you watch the animal liberation documentaries and the vegan documentaries, it's like, okay, I know that person.
Yeah.
I've seen that person speak. I've heard that person say that a million times before. And this is just like a whole new cast of people that I was unfamiliar with aside from Daniel McGowan.
But I do also think that it is important as a piece to change the tone of how we think about these sorts of actions. Like, just because it's not getting people to do them, I think like, because what I was just thinking I was going to ask you was, how do we change that climate of calling these sorts of things that don't harm people, that aren't affecting or hurting or killing individuals? How do we change it so that the media doesn't, like, or people don't just automatically label them as terrorists? And I think showing them this movie might be a good way to start that, or to start that discussion.
Yeah, no, I guess I have to agree with you there, Paul.
So and again, I think that that's one of, if not the main purpose of why they made the movie. So I think that if that's what it is, I think they were successful in doing it.
Yeah, I guess I have to agree with you, Paul. I think it's just a very successful, well done, compelling film.
Definitely.
Well, I think that's going to bring us to the end of our discussion about If a Tree Falls, a story of the Earth Liberation Front. Actually, I did like the title. It's just a story of the Earth Liberation Front. Like, they're not claiming this is the definitive story. So I did like that as well. As a humble thing for them to do as well.
Yeah, this story is about one cell of the Earth Liberation Front, and they're just kind of focusing in on that. So
yeah, and especially like one or two people even within that one cell. Mm-hmm. So yeah, endlessly fascinated by the subject matter. Highly recommend this film. I think it's well worth a watch, regardless of your stance. I think anyone could find something in it that they would grasp onto and find interesting. We want to know what all you beautiful beardos have to think about this film. So send us an email, thebeardedvegans@gmail.com. Let us know what films you want us to review in the future. We're definitely looking forward to doing these again. Mm-hmm. And definitely stay tuned. Next week, we're going to be reviewing Speciesism.
Never seen it.
Which I am so excited to dig into this one, Paul. Mostly because didn't have a podcast to discuss it when it first came out, but I think I got a lot to say. So I'm curious how I'm going to feel about it now that it's been out for at least, I want to say, 4 years maybe. And maybe I'll have a newfound appreciation for it. I don't know, but definitely go watch Speciesism wherever you can find it, and join us next week for that review.
And right before we wrap up, in case anyone did watch the movie and wants to know where Daniel currently is, according to his Wikipedia page, a credible source, it said that he was originally released to a halfway house in 2012. So he went. He was incarcerated in 2008. So then 4 years later, he was released to a halfway house. But then the following year, he was taken into custody after publishing an article under the Huffington Post for criticizing the communication management units, which we discussed in Bold Native.
And actually, this film gives a little more insight into what that means. I know we didn't go into it too much in the Bold Native, but it said that in the CMUs, they're allowed one 15-minute phone call a week and then one visit per month through glass.
Yeah.
So it's pretty harsh.
Shitty.
Yeah.
So he went back to jail in 2013 for a couple months and then was released in June of 2013. So overall, he spent about 5 years in prison.
Yeah, that sucks.
Yeah. So on that dreary note, Andy, you got anything cheery to say to me?
Well, I'm happy to be back in your presence, Paul.
Yeah.
Presence, Paul. And so even though we are recording this in advance, Paul, I think we can both say Happy New Year from the past.
Happy New Year.
Or for the future. I don't know what it is.
Hope 2018 is going okay.
I'm sure everything's just fine. But we have one other message from the past. And that is the following 7 words.
We are the Bearded Vegans. Signing off.
So baby progress, I can't believe it. Till the towers are puncturing the sun. Equal going against the sky, another war, another battle to be won. Take me down, shut me out. Watch the smoke fade into the sky. Same suspect, same story. Ask the right questions and I'll tell you no lies. Think right, this place is insane. And we all believe every word is true.
I think it's a really great watch. I think that... Damn it, Paul. Sorry. I guess in spoilers, I do want to talk about is like, we're talking about this on a vegan... God damn it, Paul.
Yeah. And yeah. Yeah.
And yeah.
And yeah.
And yep. So let me ask you this: is like you? Well, you don't have to be Bonnie and Clyde to be a bank robber, and you don't. Shut up, Paul.